Okay, good afternoon. My dissertation is on administrator perspectives of best practices and transition services for students with disabilities. The problem that I found through my career is that students with disabilities struggle to transition to post-secondary destinations. We know based on Pennington's research that they are 3 to 4 times less likely to be employed after high school. We also know based on high school dropout statistics that in Maryland, they are underperforming their non-disabled peers as far as dropout rates. Their dropout rates are higher. And when they disaggregate the data, students with specific learning disabilities have the highest rate of dropout. We also know that the federal government has put in place rules and regulations to help support students with disabilities. In Maryland, transition planning starts at the age of 14. We also know that Maryland Career and College Readiness Standards and Common Core Standards have increased the rigor, and the support is critical for our students. And we also know that despite all of this legislation, 504 Act, IDEA, all of those things, we know that there's gaps in implementation related to transition for students with disabilities. We also know that parents don't trust the program leads. We know that teachers have limited confidence, and we know that administrators find that transition is important. We know that they're the head of the school. We know that it is part of their responsibility to ensure that students are accessing their education with fidelity, and that includes our students with special needs. We also know that their voice is essentially absent from the research. So the theoretical framework that I developed was a combination or a convergence, if you will, of both Kohler and Schlossberg's theory. If you look at this like an iceberg, the things that you would see above the water in the light blue are things that we're used to seeing, such as students being gainfully employed, them getting diplomas, them having life skills, living independently, and being successful in their transition. But what we don't often focus on is the things that are not so easily seen. And that's where the theory comes in. And I found that Schlossberg's theories of how students move through, in, through, and out of the different settings in order to be successful is very important as an educator. But I also found that Kohler's taxonomy of transition is really important in how we address transition needs in the schoolhouse. So the purpose of this study was threefold. It was to develop and understand the best practices in transition related to research. And then I used the research that I developed to guide my quantitative study. I also wanted to take that best practices list that I found using research and find out how frequently administrators were aware of and noticed the implementation and practicing the best practices in their school. I also wanted to understand any challenges or barriers that were set forth to implement transition planning services. These are my research questions. I'll go into more depth with them. Essentially, I'm looking to find out what they know about transition, how familiar are they with the laws, what do they do in their schools, how often are they involved with transition, both the documents and the students, and of course, what barriers. The design of my project was a sequential explanatory mixed methods design, and that means that I am starting with a quantitative survey, and it's going to guide the questions and the conversations that I have to get more understanding of those items. I did a snowball sample. I used my own personal network and people that I knew, and I also did a social media posting. I had 98 participants respond, 2 of which were excluded because they did not meet the criteria as middle or high school administrators, so they were removed. And I had 8 participants volunteer to be interviewed. So for research question 1, I was really looking at how administrators engage in the school and what they're aware of being done related to transition. My findings concluded that they were inconsistent in their engagement and awareness of transition-related services. They had limited exposure to the special ed law. They spent about 11 to 20 hours per week working with students with disabilities and their families. That included attending IEP meetings and doing other related tasks. But they focused on transition services only sometimes. They also spent more time. The good news is that students with disabilities spent more time discussing post-secondary plans, but it was only reported as quarterly. 3/4 of administrators also reported that they sometimes look for transition-related items in the curriculum when they're observing teachers. On this slide, first, the question that this slide is referencing is what importance administrators place on the best practices of transition. So while you're looking at the screen, you'll see the 14 best practices that I discovered through literature as being crucial to transitioning. The ones that are highlighted in red are the ones that administrators ranked as essential. So clearly there is a gap in understanding overall, but administrators had some understanding of how important it was, in that all administrators said all 14 of them were either very important or essential, but 0 were occurring even monthly or more in the schoolhouse. We calculated a Spearman's Row, and we noticed that there was no statistically significant relationships between frequency and how important the best practices were by administrators. Research question 3 is really focusing on the laws of indicator 13 and 14, which govern transition. Indicator 13 is more about the services in the schoolhouse, and indicator 14 is really focused on data collection post high school and what they're doing 5 years out. The majority of administrators were somewhat familiar with 13, but even less familiar with indicator 14. Most administrators felt that they were less familiar with, obviously, 14, and they reported that they could definitely use some additional training. 1/3 of them were completely unaware that there was a specific budget for transition services, and 2/3 of them reported using knowledge of transition in conversation with students. However, I didn't get a lot of feedback in this question that I was expecting. That was a little bit unexpected. This is the demographics of my sample population for my qualitative interviews. And as you can see here, most of the participants were from Maryland. Most of them were from larger public schools, and most of them are assistant principals. So I want you to keep that in mind as I continue to discuss my data. So when we talk about challenges and barriers for best practices, when you look at this screen, you'll see some of the things that the interviewees said related to transition that they felt were barriers. And the larger the text, the more it was stated in interviews. The themes that emerged are categorized based on the criteria. So themes that were ranked were in categories such as parents, students, teachers, community concerns, curriculum issues, and then just holistic concerns that were causing issues with transition. A lot of the focus was on curriculum and the infusion throughout the day. The barriers here are listed in 3 categories: parents and students, human capital or staffing, and funding. A lot of comments about home life interferences, unrealistic job expectations, untrained staff, lack of modifications to already existing transition paperwork and websites and those types of things, or having no curriculum at all to infuse transition in the classroom. I did a joint display to demonstrate how my quantitative information, my qualitative information supported my quantitative, in that the construct is on the left. In the middle, you can find the information from the
quantitative data, and then on the right is the things that came up in my interviews. So here we have a majority of participants took a law class 2 to 3 times in their career. However, they were saying staffing turnover impacts transition. People are overwhelmed with the position. Special ed courses um, were so long ago when they got their administrator certificates. Um, in influencing the best practices and the frequency of the best practices occurring in their school. Of course, 6 were listed as essential and 8 were listed as very important. And in the interviews, we found that there were various levels of delegation, in that a lot of those that were interviewed discussed that it was somebody else's responsibility to perform some of these duties, and they weren't sure if they were happening, or there were challenges with families that were impacting getting to this place, or stakeholders in the community weren't aware of what needed to occur. Additionally, half of administrators were somewhat familiar or less with indicators 13 and 14. They admitted to having a limited awareness of law. They admitted that college and career fairs are happening, however, nothing is being modified, and they are not sure that transportation and other modifications are even occurring at all. Apprenticeships are becoming more prevalent in the state of Maryland. However, more discussions on trade and vocational opportunities for students with disabilities need to occur. Transition facilitators are helpful. However, they needed dedicated people in the building to really focus in and hone in on this skill. They also said that they're struggling to get teachers to feel like it's not just one more thing, and training their teachers overall. Recommendations that they had for the improvement of transition services include infusing transition language throughout the curriculum so that it's not just a one-off, but it's infused in their everyday language. They also wanted to begin conversations about transition in the earlier grades. Administrators recommended a more collaborative approach to transition that includes all the stakeholders. They also wanted additional experiences with daily living skills and adult life skills, not just for students who are not seeking a diploma, but also for the diploma-bound students. They expressed that work-based learning and career research development teachers are vital within the school, and that modifying career planning to meet the needs of students with disabilities is essential. When I reflect on the theoretical framework, Schlossberg is talking about how students move in, through, and out their high school experiences as they go from middle school essentially through to their post-secondary outcomes, whereas Kohler is providing more hands-on tactile guidance for teachers to effectively transition and things that can be done. The convergence of these two theories works best to guide transition, because practitioners need to not only understand where students start and where they're going, but they also need to know the why of what we're doing, as well as the how. For students with disabilities to successfully move through transition, they have to participate in many of the practices that are listed on the best practices list. So if our administrators know that they're essential, encouraging them to not only be aware, but make sure that they're happening in their schools would be crucial. We also know it's the administrator's responsibility, and they're crucial to this process. And without their input and their awareness and urgency, our students are being underserved at this time. So what do I plan to do with this information? Well, that's a good question. I plan to speak with legislators and share my findings so that administrators can hopefully gain some more awareness, and the need for professional development related to transition services is evident, not only for teachers who feel uncomfortable, but also for administrators who are at the helm of the school and in charge of the budget. I would like to work toward better transitions for students with disabilities through continued advocacy for best practices of transition, as I do in my current role. I would also like to work with pre-service teachers and administrators to foster better understandings of special ed and why it's important and the significant needs that surround transition planning, because there are diverse needs there. And ideally, I'd like to develop a stair-stepped curriculum that builds and supports the needs of students with disabilities that can be implemented right away in the classroom. Teachers can pick it up and go do this, and students can learn about a career cluster. Those are my goals based on this research. If I could do this again, I would make sure I had more principals in my interviews, because I was wondering as I went through the research, does the role of assistant principal differ from the role of principal? And I didn't really have enough principals in this study in order to make a clear delineation. However, the principal that I did interview seemed to be so much less aware than the assistant principals were that I interviewed. I also would like to ask questions about the delegation of responsibility specifically, because I feel like perhaps I need to follow up with the person that is doing more of the hands-on tasks, or who has been delegated to even see if they're aware, what do they know, how were they trained also. The limitations of my study are the small sample size. However, I did get a vast state count in my study because I used social media. I just felt like my generalizability was limited due to the number I got. The inability to match respondents' survey answers to the interview participants based on research design parameters set by the IRB caused me some complications, because I wanted to be able to look at what administrators said on the survey and find out why. And the limitations set by the IRB prevented me from making those deeper connections. I also found that self-reported data has its disadvantages, in that administrators might not be as honest as you would think they would be or hope them to be. So it's limited in that, how aware are they? How much attention do they really focus on transition with self-reported data? So does anybody have any questions?